This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Vermont's legislators are hard at work crafting an education reform bill. The House's version has passed and arrives in the Senate this week. Later this hour, we'll talk with two superintendents about the proposed changes, including school district consolidation and class size minimums. We'll also talk about changes to federal funding for low-income students. But first, the U.S. House of Representatives has passed the SAVE Act. This happened late last week. It would require people to show multiple documents proving their U.S. citizenship when they register to vote. House Republicans and 4 Democrats voted for it. They say it'll keep non-U.S. citizens from voting. But critics worry it's actually going to disenfranchise millions of Americans. Here to explain how the SAVE Act would affect individual states is Vermont's Secretary of State Sarah Copeland Hanzas. She was reelected to a second term last year. Secretary of State, welcome back to Vermont Edition.
Hi, Michaela. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're glad to have you, as well as you, our listeners. Do you have questions about the SAVE Act or thoughts on how these changes to the country's voter ID laws could impact voting in your state? You can call in at 800-639-2211. And we're only speaking with Secretary of State Sarah Copeland Hanzas in this first segment of our show, so don't hesitate if you have questions for her. Okay, I want to start with a clip from Vermont's sole representative to Congress, Democrat Becca Ballen. She voted against the SAVE Act last week and then posted a video to her social media channels with some pretty strong words about the bill.
So many Vermonters have written to me and called my office with serious concerns about this bill. And the SAVE Act should really scare all of us. The name of the bill is perverse because it doesn't save our democracy. It doesn't protect voting. Instead, it has the potential to strip away the voting eligibility of nearly 70 million American women. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This Republican bill is a form of voter suppression.
So do you agree with our representative that this bill, if passed by the Senate, if it becomes law, that it could make it harder for some Americans, including married women, to vote? And if so, why?
Yes, I do agree with Congresswoman Ballen. She hit the nail on the head. You know, this proposal would require every American to show in person documentary proof of citizenship with their election official in order to be on the voter registration rolls. This will disadvantage elderly folks who have trouble getting out down to their town clerk's office. This will impact rural people who maybe live in one town but leave early in the morning for a job in another town. This would require them to take time off of work in order to go down to their town clerk's office. This will be a huge burden on our town and city clerks who will need to extend their office hours and provide personnel to be able to take people's documentary proof of citizenship. And what Congresswoman Ballen was talking about there, in particular with respect to women, is that many women, when they get married, change their name. And if you've changed your name and your current name on your driver's license, for instance, doesn't match your birth certificate, then you need to gather other documentation in order to prove who you are and that you are a citizen. And so this will require a number of different hurdles and a fair expense, not just in terms of the time that I already talked about, but just in ordering certified copies of those documents. And, you know, I know a lot of people around Vermont who don't sit at a computer all day, every day, and they don't have a printer at home to be able to print off the application form to request their birth certificate or a copy of their marriage license or their divorce decree. So it's going to cost them a lot of time and expense and hassle of figuring out how to pull those documents together and then go down in person to talk to their clerk.
So you've concerns about a number of large groups, including the many women and small but noble cohort of men who changed their names when they got married. On Friday, the White House press secretary called this argument fear-mongering by Democrats. And I do wonder, like, would Republicans really want to disenfranchise millions of American women? I mean, so many women, of course, voted for President Trump and for Republicans.
Well, I can't really speak to their motivation, but what I can say is that the reality on the ground is that this will cause a hurdle for many people. When the original executive order came out on March 25th, I decided, well, I'd better start going through the steps in the process. I better make sure that I have my birth certificate and my marriage license so that I can prove who I am, so that I can say to Vermonters, these are the steps that it takes. That was 2.5 weeks ago, and I still don't have the copy of my birth certificate that I need. I mailed an application to the city that I was born in, and it turns out they only keep records 10 years back. So they sent it back to me, and now I need to speak to the county about getting my birth certificate. So, if you are a Vermonter who, is busy with life and maybe the election sneaks up on you, 2.5 weeks is a long time. And if you didn't happen to think, oh gosh, I should have those documents on hand, then you could find yourself on Election Day ineligible to vote.
And just to clarify here, I know some states, including New Hampshire, have passed proof of citizenship laws. Does Vermont have any of those laws on the books in order to vote in state elections?
So Vermont has always operated on the principle of self-attestation, that when you sign up to vote, you are checking a box that says, I am a citizen of the United States, and you are signing that form that says, under the pains and penalties of perjury. And that has always worked for us. We find, looking at the voter registration rolls, that it is very, very, very rare for somebody who's not a citizen to wind up on our voter registration rolls. And Michaela, when they accidentally do, maybe because they checked the wrong box at the Department of Motor Vehicles, they are usually calling their town clerk and saying, please take me off this list. If you're living here, maybe raising a family here, or maybe you're working hard here to send money back home to your family, the last thing that you want to do is commit a deportable offense and risk never being able to attain citizenship. The fact of the matter is, non-citizens do not vote in Vermont elections, in American elections. And so the thought that we should disenfranchise and inconvenience and cause expense to the rest of the voting public because of this very, very rare instance is, I think, outrageous.
Oh, non-citizens do not vote in state or federal elections, but in 3 Vermont cities, non-U.S. citizens can legally vote in local elections. So that's for things like the city council members or local bond votes. Will this affect that?
So in those cities, the clerk will keep a separate voter registration list for all people who are eligible to vote for those local elections. And that is kept separate and outside of our statewide voter registration system that includes people who are eligible to vote in federal elections. So our main voter registration system has all citizens who are eligible to vote. We don't know whether this will impact the ability of those communities to continue to include all residents in being able to vote on local issues. We certainly will fight to defend their right to include all of their neighbors in their local decision-making, but it remains to be seen.
We're speaking with Vermont's Secretary of State Sarah Copeland Hanzas about the SAVE Act, which the U.S. House of Representatives passed last week. It would require people to show multiple documents proving their U.S. citizenship when they register to vote. Let's take a couple questions from our phone lines. We have Alan in Ludlow first. Alan, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hey, good afternoon, and thanks for being on the show, Ms. Copeland Hanzas. Has anyone challenged this preemptory for its constitutionality? States have the right to decide how their representatives are elected and how they register people to vote. And I don't want somebody from Arkansas telling me how I need to vote to elect my representatives in the state level and in the U.S. level as well. And I'm just questioning why this has even gotten as far as it has. I admit I haven't read the SAVE Act, so I'm kind of ignorant as to what's in it, other than voter ID or multiple IDs to go vote. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Yes, Secretary, there's so many legal challenges to some of the actions of the Trump administration. It can be hard to keep up. Is this something that the Attorney General here, Charity Clark, has opposed?
Yes, when the executive order came out, which includes many of the same components as the SAVE Act, our Attorney General joined in with 18 other states in contesting this exactly as Alan says. The Constitution is really clear that states will determine the time, place, and manner of elections, and that only Congress can put certain parameters around that. And in fact, Congress has in the past deliberated whether there should be a proof of citizenship requirement, back in the early 1990s, and opted not to do that. I think in part because the reality is there is no one agency of the federal government that can prove our citizenship for us. And therefore, the burden of proof falls to us as individuals needing to reach out to whatever entity is holding on to your documents. Now, if you are a person who plans to travel out of the country, you might have a passport, in which case you've probably already jumped through those hoops and you would be able to use your passport to prove your citizenship. But many people who aren't planning to travel or can't afford that $200 to get a passport will then have to assemble those documents themselves. So I think in order for this to be workable, and New Hampshire has found this, Kansas and Arizona also passed proof of citizenship laws and are finding them to be really clunky and difficult and unworkable, and frankly, a burden on the individual voter. Because if government wants to require us to prove our citizenship, then government ought to be providing us with proof of our citizenship and not leaving it to us as individuals.
Let's go next to Matthew in Alberg. Matthew, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Greetings, and thank you for taking my call. The question I have is, I did look at the SAVE Act, which I definitely oppose because it's targeting certain, marginalized communities, and communities of color. How can we, as a person of color myself, how can we protect the most vulnerable, including those, that individuals with disabilities? That's putting them on a chopping block here. How can we protect, our small state? And how can we, accept this proposal from Washington, knowing that it's going to be targeted to those vulnerable groups, across, the nation?
Matthew, thank you so much for your question. And yes, also just to clarify for guests who are just joining us, the SAVE Act was passed by the House last week. It has not yet passed the Senate, and there's a chance that it might not because Republicans don't have the majority that they would need to pass it and get over a filibuster, which is very likely to occur if this gets to the Senate floor. But Secretary of State Sarah Copeland Hanzas, thoughts on Matthew's concerns about this bill?
Yeah, I agree that it feels like it's really targeted at certain populations to put additional barriers in front of people's right to vote. Your right to vote should be guaranteed in a democracy. It is the people who elect their leaders. It's not the leaders who get to select the people who are allowed to vote. And, because this is so nonsensical, because it's a solution in search of a problem, it really does call into question why it is we would try to do this. The Brennan Center for Justice did an analysis of voting across the nation and found that non-citizen voting happens in about 0.0001% of the time. And if you do the math calculation on the number of Vermonters who cast ballots, that means it would take us 3 election cycles or 6 years for a single person possibly to cast a single ballot. So the idea that we need to throw everything up in the air in order to prevent that small a percentage of a chance that someone who's not eligible might slip through the cracks is really, well, I said it before, it's outrageous.
Secretary, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, CISA, if you could handle one more acronym, it's facing significant cuts. It's part of the Department of Homeland Security, and its staff protect election security infrastructure, among other things. And CBS News recently reported that about 1,300 of its 3,400 employees could be incentivized to leave or laid off soon. I'm curious if you've heard any more about this, if you could explain how you work with this agency and if there are overlaps between those cuts and what we're talking about here with voter ID laws.
So the loss of CISA is really a very deep and grave threat to the security of our elections. And so it's a little bit counterintuitive to, on the one hand, have this proposal that's supposed to make our elections more secure, and on the backside seeing that we are undermining that by taking away this agency that protects us against very real and concrete examples of threats to our elections. So Vermont worked with CISA during the past election cycle, as we have in many previous election cycles. They came in and did physical security assessments in our Montpelier election offices, but also for many town and city clerks. They do cybersecurity assessments. They send out bulletins on cybersecurity best practices, updates when they see trends. They also offer penetration testing, so they can take your statewide election system and essentially try to poke holes into it and help you in a friendly way to reveal whether there are any vulnerabilities. They also offer really important information sharing across different states, because we might see one instance in Vermont and we might repel a potential attack. But if we don't also tell our neighboring states that we saw that and this is where it came from and this is how you protect against it, then we're leaving our friends and our neighbors vulnerable as well. And so the loss of CISA really does leave a bit of a pit of dread in my stomach, because we rely on that. And the thought that little old Vermont would be able to stand up that kind of support all on its own is pretty daunting. I don't know what sort of a budget we would need to be able to do for ourselves what CISA has been doing for all of us.
Secretary of State Sarah Copeland Hanzas, many busy work days ahead of you, it sounds like. Thank you so much for joining us on Vermont Edition today.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up, we're going to speak with two school superintendents about the proposed changes to how schools in Vermont are paid for. That's in just a minute on Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Every weekday, parents across our region drop their kids off at school, wave goodbye, and hope they learned something new. At this point in the school year, everyone has pretty much found their routine. But over in central offices, superintendents and school district staffers are trying to navigate massive education funding changes at both the state and federal levels. In Vermont, lawmakers are working on generational reform to Vermont's pre-K to 12 system after a wave of school budget defeats last March. And in Washington, D.C., the Trump administration has effectively dismantled the U.S. Department of Education. It's also been trying to enforce a ban on diversity, equity, and inclusion practices in school by threatening to take away Title I funding. Though recently, the U.S. Department of Ed paused those enforcement efforts until after April 24th. How are our own school leaders processing all of this news? How does it affect their work? Well, here to tell us more is Brooke Olson-Farrell. She's the superintendent of the Slate Valley Unified School District, which is based in Fairhaven, where they oversee 5 different schools. Brooke, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We're also joined by Elaine Collins, the superintendent of schools for North Country Supervisory Union in Newport, which consists of 12 schools and 16 school boards in the Northeast Kingdom. Elaine, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and listeners, you can join our conversation as well. We know there's a lot going on in the world of education, and perhaps you're confused about what these changes, both in the Vermont legislature and at the federal level, mean for your kids or the schools in your backyard. You can call in at 800-639-2211 or send us an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. So, Elaine and Brooke, I would like to start by letting each of you introduce your school districts or supervisory unions to us. Elaine, we'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about North Country's supervisory union and the schools that you represent.
The Country Supervisory Union is, we're in the upper tier of Vermont. Many of our schools border the Canadian border. We have 12 operating school districts, 2 non-operating districts, and a town that is school choice within our supervisory union. We have regional high school and a centralized middle school. And then we have many K to 6, pre-K to 6 schools and pre-K to 8 schools in our configuration. We have about 65 miles from one end to the other and about 520 square miles in between. We are the largest geographical region in the state. And we did not unify during Act 46, which means, as you said, each of those individual school districts have individual school boards that are governing each of those small schools or not so small schools. And our supervisory union serves as sort of an umbrella to help coordinate and unify things like curriculum and assessment, instructional practices, grant work, and special ed and other things.
So how many school board meetings are you going to each month?
It's 15 school board meetings and then 2 additional committee meetings, so 17 a month. Thank goodness there's an assistant superintendent this year. This is the first year. If you add in PCBs and high schoolers and tents in the beginning of the school year, and we're in a negotiation cycle, and then throw in some student hearings and other things. It's been a busy school year so far.
Yeah, sounds like it. Well, Brooke, let's turn to you. You work within a different structure there at Slate Valley Unified School District. Tell us about your district.
Sure. So we are a single school district. So we have 1 school board, 18 school board members. And we have been through 2 previous mergers. So when I started here 8 years ago, we had 48 school board members and 8 school boards. So there's been some significant reduction in terms of governance footprint. We have about 1,250 students and cover 6 towns: Fairhaven, Castleton, West Haven, Hubbardton, Orwell, and Benson. And we're about 200 square miles and employ about 300 full and part-time employees.
So I'd like to start by talking with you about what's going on at the state level, and then we'll shift to some of these big federal changes going on. So let me just give a little bit of background first about what's been going on over in Montpelier that could affect Vermont schools eventually. So just last week, the Vermont House passed this sweeping education reform package, and the generalities of it pretty much line up with what Governor Scott and Republicans have proposed, like consolidating school districts and switching to this foundation formula where the state decides how much Vermont schools should spend, not local voters. That's a major simplification. But there are also tons of details that are still very much under the air and being hotly debated, including who is going to be in charge of making these redistricting maps and how fast the process will happen. I'm curious how closely you two are following these developments, or is this something that's just going on in the background of everything else that is on your plates as superintendents? Elaine with North Country, we'll start with you.
Well, we have I should have mentioned in my intro, we have about 2,750 students and about 750 employees across our different sites. And so originally our district, our supervisory union structure was about the right size, right? And now it's being, the proposition now is changed to be about a district of 4,000. So that would mean adding more folks to our rosters. I think it's hard not to pay attention, right? And not to have advocacy for your particular area. I'm not sure, everybody's geography is a little bit different. And North Country's geography for the most part, makes it very difficult for us to try to consolidate schools or to make our smaller schools larger. And I think a lot of schools in Vermont are in a very similar place in that it would be difficult to close two schools and try to put those two schools into another school because there just isn't a place, there isn't room in each of those schools and another school to take them on. So unless there's significant construction funds to go along with consolidation of schools, then that would be very hard for us to do. The district consolidation, I'm not sure what that would look like, right? It's there's so many things that change from day to day around proposals or amendments, and now it's in the Senate, and the Senate will put their own footprint on it. It's hard to know how it will impact. I am sort of adamantly opposed to taking away the ability for voters to have a say in what the fate of their school is. And when you create mega districts or larger districts where boards are consolidated and there's less voice for smaller schools, I worry about what that might mean in terms of the voice of that small school being heard in a larger district. For sure, change needs to happen. We can't continue down this road where voters are being outpriced from their homes and the property tax continues to rise. And so I'm not sure where the balance will be between those two things, but change is coming, right? And so what does that change look like? We're not quite sure yet, I don't think.
It could mean you go to a couple fewer school board meetings each month, right?
That wouldn't be a hard sell.
And Brooke, what about you? What are you following when it comes to this education reform package that's happening in Montpelier? And what elements are you just like, this can't be part of my day to day right now. I've got to do what I've got to do as superintendent.
So I'm following it pretty closely because it does have huge implications for my district. We are a district that struggles with providing adequate local funds for our schools. Last year, it took us 5 times to pass a budget. Tomorrow, we'll be voting for the second time on a school budget, despite being one of the bottom spenders in the state. And so our schools are continually under-resourced in Slate Valley. And so I see some opportunity to make sure that our students have adequate resources with a shift in the funding formula. However, I am concerned about the stripping away of local control and what that looks like. I do not think that will be very popular in our community. And I also wonder about how a foundation formula actually impacts taxpayers in Slate Valley. Because right now, relatively, our taxes are very low compared to other towns throughout the state. And so the foundation formula would give us more spending per pupil. So it would be, the assumption would be made that some of this would actually raise taxes in some areas that were lower spending to begin with.
Yes, I did see that the House's education reform proposal would dramatically redistribute money across regions, as you're both saying, and several areas, including both the Rutland area and the Northeast Kingdom region, would receive significantly more money than they currently spend. And then Addison County and the eastern parts of Chittenden County would see reductions in funding. So, Brooke, you're saying that more funding might sound good, but that also you're concerned that it could mean higher taxes?
It could be in some areas. And so really, I think we need to look closely at the modeling for that because many of my community members are saying they want taxes lower. And that's part of the reason they're voting no on the budget. And this may have the opposite effect for some of the taxpayers in our towns. And so I think that really needs to be looked at and considered closely.
And to return to the topic of class and school size minimums, Elaine, how do your families feel about those? Are these conversations you're having a lot with folks about the possibility of closures due to class sizes?
Yeah, we have two schools that are about 80 students. One is a pre-K to 6 and one is a pre-K to 8. Those school boards have had lots of conversations about trying to remain viable and what does that mean. The same for some of our mid-level schools, which are about 120 to 150 students, are also having some of those conversations. We do have one elementary school that is about 320, another that's about 550, and then our middle school, and high school. High school is about 720 students. So it's ironic with all of our small towns feeding into the high school. The high school is right sized, right, and our district is not. So folks are worried about it. We have two non-operating districts because two schools did close. Morgan and Holland had about 30 students when their voters went through the painstaking and heartbreaking decision to close their community schools. They tuition their students to Derby Elementary School. That's the largest elementary school we have in our supervisory union. And there are some outlying kids, not all kids, but some outlying kids in those communities that are on the bus for an hour and a half one way. That's an extraordinary amount of time for a kindergartner, first grader, second grader. Older kids may have more resilience when it comes to being on the bus that length of time, but I worry about 5-year-olds being on a bus that length of time. That's 3 hours a day. And if we have more closures, I worry about how that magnifies that problem. The transportation up here is complicated. Each of our districts does slightly different things for transportation, and just the logistics of getting kids back and forth to school is somewhat problematic on a good day with a lack of bus drivers and the distances that buses are traveling.
And let's take a call here. We have Tom calling in from Fletcher. Tom, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks for taking the call. I was on a school board a number of years ago, and one of the things I saw was how much administration we have. And I always found it a bit ridiculous that we have as many supervisory unions in the state of Vermont. And we need to get to the point where we consolidate supervisory unions and not schools. I like the small schools. I don't care for so much administration because that overhead is just killing us. The Franklin West Supervisory Board, or the union itself, there's more than $1 million in salaries, and it's just, you multiply that by all the supervisory unions in the state, and it's just too much.
Well, Tom, thank you for calling in. I'm going to toss this one to Brooke to get your thoughts on. I mean, whenever we talk about school consolidation, one of the main concerns that we hear is, there's too many overhead costs, too much money going towards administration, and not right into kids' classrooms. How do you address those concerns in the budget conversations that are happening right now in Slate Valley?
Yes, absolutely. I hear that concern often. It's something we have definitely looked at throughout our school district supervisory union before, and we have been able to reduce some costs. I think part of it for us is the amount of legislation and compliance that school districts have to do on both the state level and the federal level. And so just the amount of paperwork that's required. And so there is a need in order for us to comply with state and federal mandates to have a certain level of administration. That being said, we're always looking for efficiencies throughout the system. If we were to cut, I believe, all central offices in the state, it saves about $180 million, which certainly, is a little bit of a savings, but it's certainly not going to move the needle a whole lot on taxes.
Well, we do have to pause for a short break here. When we come back, I'd like us to speak about some of the changes going on at the federal level and how those could impact Vermont schools. We're talking with Brooke Olson Farrell, the superintendent of Slate Valley Unified School District, and Elaine Collins, superintendent of North Country Supervisory Union. This is Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. With the dismantling of the U.S. Department of Education and changes at the state level to how Vermont funds its education system in the works, there's a lot of uncertainty around the future of funding for our schools. We're talking about it with two people who handle school funding issues every single day. Elaine Collins is the superintendent of North Country Supervisory Union in the NEK, and Brooke Olson Farrell is the superintendent of Slate Valley Unified School District, which is based in Fairhaven. If you have thoughts on this conversation we're having or questions for these two superintendents, you can call in at 800-639-2211. So let's turn now to Title I funding. Earlier this month, the White House threatened to deny this type of federal funding for students from low-income families unless state education leaders verified that they've eliminated all DEI programs in schools, which the White House now deems illegal. First, I want to get a sense of the role that Title I funding plays in each of your in the schools that you both oversee. Elaine, let's start with you.
Yeah, so our to the caller's point, Tom, earlier, our central office costs about $22.8 million to run. That's the equivalent of 166 people. That's special educators, administrators. It's our curriculum department. It's the superintendent's office. It's bookkeeping and human resources. Of that $22.8 million, we assess back to our schools only $8.8 million because we manage a lot of grants, and many of those are federal grants. So titles funds, our special ed funds, those are all our encore funds, our after-school program funds. Those all come from federal sources. So that would have a reduction in federal funds would have a huge impact on us. Our free and reduced hot lunch percentage across our district is more than almost 60%. And many of our schools are higher than that. So with a reduction in titles funds that really target high poverty schools, it disproportionately impacts kids of need, our most vulnerable kids. So that would be very detrimental to our work, not only at our central office, but also in our individual schools, because we sub-grant out more money than what we receive into our individual schools for strategies like interventionists and other things.
So that's the role Title I is playing in North Country. Brooke, what about in the Slate Valley School District?
So overall, we receive about $2.7 million in federal funds from all different federal sources, and about $1 million of that is title funds, and that serves us by providing interventionists in all of our elementary schools to work with our most struggling students. And really to close the achievement gap between our free and reduced lunch kiddos and our non-free and reduced lunch kiddos. And we've been able to effectively do that over the last couple of years. And so reduction of those funds would be catastrophic to Slate Valley. We do not fund any of those positions with local money. In addition, two of our administrative positions, our curriculum director and our special ed director, are funded through federal funds as well. So when we talk about administration, that's not just local money that we're talking about. We're also talking about federal funds. Also, our federal funds fund our behavioral coaches that work with our kiddos that have experienced trauma. Our home to school liaison is funded through Medicaid funds, which is another federal funding source that we use. And so all of these reductions would target our most vulnerable populations of students, and that would be really detrimental to the education of students within Slate Valley.
And what I'm struck by hearing both of your responses there is just the vast amount of services that schools provide to students and families beyond simply teaching math and reading and social studies. Vermont's Agency of Education initially asked individual school district leaders to respond to them with details of their DEI programs, but then walked that back and said that instead they're actually going to send a single statewide certification. I'm curious if you were both on board with this initial plan of responding individually. I know many school leaders were not. Elaine?
I'm happy that the secretary has walked that back. And actually, both Brooke and I met with the secretary this morning so that she could update us about the response they'll be sending out today to the federal government about the assurance that's being required, or the certification that's being required. I appreciate the secretary's stance on this, and appreciate that she is not being shy about defining what the law states, and we're agreeing to what the law states and nothing outside of what the law states.
That's Agency of Education Secretary Zoe Saunders. Brooke, what was your takeaway from this meeting with her?
It was similar to Elaine's. I'm very grateful that we're now taking a statewide approach. I think it's problematic when each individual superintendent or school district was making a decision whether or not to sign that certification letter that was requested by the federal government. So very appreciative of the statewide unified approach, as I think many of us believe we already comply with the civil rights law.
Well, there's this uncertainty around Title I funding. And again, some of this has gotten pushed back by a couple of weeks. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with this funding just yet. But at the same time, the Department of Education is being dissolved. At the federal level, thousands of employees have been let go over the past month. How exactly does that affect your work and your classrooms? Does it, Elaine?
The federal dismantling comes out in weird ways, right? Because there's no contact any longer to go to for a particular thing, and so we're finding that with our state partners who are working with us on various initiatives, who say they're going to need to reach out to their federal partners, and then that might take some time, right? Because who is that federal partner who's going to respond to the request? So far, I would say it's the federal context, other than the certification request and kind of the hype that's happening all the time in the media, and the worries that brings, as well as the executive orders that are being signed, has had, for the most part, it's had very little impact on our day-to-day, I would say. The worry I have is what's going to happen to funding down the road. That will have, as we've both said, really negative impacts, tremendous negative impacts on both of our districts, if there are decreases in our titles funds or in Medicaid funds in the future.
Brooke, has this had any impact on your day-to-day?
Not my day-to-day a bit, but certainly a teacher in the classroom, their day-to-day probably a little bit less right now. Certainly with the uncertainty around Title I funding, although we believe that will be fully funded for the next school year, there has been some uneasiness around that, as it impacts a good number of our employees that may not have jobs as a result of that. So there's certainly a lot of questions regarding that, and spending time with those teachers trying to reassure them, or just maybe not even reassure them, but answer questions to the degree that we know the answers right now. The only other impact that we've seen in the district is because of the clawback of some unspent ESSER monies, which were the COVID relief monies. Actually, at the state level, that has disrupted some of the literacy professional development that our teachers were receiving through the Agency of Education. So that has been paused. But that right now is really the only direct impact as of today.
And Brooke, you mentioned this earlier, but folks in your region are going to return to polls tomorrow to vote on the budget for Slate Valley Unified School District, which didn't pass on town meeting day. How are you feeling about that vote?
Cautiously optimistic. I mean, we've reduced another $500,000 from our local budget, and it provides a substantial tax rate for many of our communities. Some of our towns will see a tax rate decrease as much as 20%. So I'm really hoping that folks get out and vote tomorrow, because voter turnout is one of our biggest hurdles, and that we're able to pass a budget, because it does create a lot of uncertainty within the system.
Well, lastly, since we've been talking so much about, some things beyond our control here in Vermont and the surrounding region, and also a lot of things that take place in offices far, far away. I'm wondering if we could return to the classroom and our students just a bit. I know you two are part of central office. You don't get to be with students every single day, but wondering if there is perhaps either a moment or even like a larger program, something going on at one of the schools in your region that you'd like to tell us about to kind of help us reconnect with the kids here we're talking about educating. Elaine, we'll start with you.
Sure, I'm happy and hopeful about a change that we made last year to adopt a new literacy program. We're in year 0 of a literacy program across our 12 sites, and there's been a lot of excitement and engagement, and I see kids excited about the learning that they're doing in their new literacy program, and that gives me hope. As a former middle school literacy teacher, it gives me hope that we are providing a good foundation for students so that they can be literate and productive members of society. And I see being literate as one of our civil rights, that we should be able to be articulate and an active participant in our local democracy. And by doing that, by being literate, we're able to empower kids to grow up to be our next great citizens.
I can't imagine anything more magical than teaching a kid to read. Also, I have a kid who is trying to learn how to read. It seems just very hard to do. So congratulations on that work. Brooke, what about you?
So to build off what Elena said, I mean, we've seen really some remarkable growth, especially at our elementary level, in our student growth scores. So students achieving, the growth metrics, and also achieving proficiency metrics at a higher rate than in previous years. And we have done a lot of targeted professional development, specifically at our elementary levels, using title funds with our instructional coaching model to really build up our skills in literacy. Also, we're seeing, our staff retention rate went from 78% to 93% in our district. So really, really proud of that, because we know the most powerful influence on student outcomes is the educator in the classroom. So super important. And, just recently, last week, one of our small schools had, the Night of the Arts, where students were celebrating, what they were doing in music and in art. And it was just amazing to see all of the smiles and enthusiasm from the students and for what they're doing each and every day in their classrooms. So.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. Brooke Olson-Farrell is the superintendent of Slate Valley Unified School District, which covers 5 different schools. Brooke, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
We are also joined by Elaine Collins, superintendent of North Country Supervisory Union in the NEK. Elaine, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having us.
All right, that is all the time we have for today's Vermont Edition. It was directed by Mary Angish and produced by Andrea Lorian. Our call screener was Kelly Delorier, and our theme music is by Myra Flynn. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch up again soon.